Well, hey, welcome to another episode of Safeonomics. I'm Scott Cuthbert, co-founder of Safeopedia.
And I'm Gabe Encarnacion with BBL Safety.
Yeah, and we're super pleased to be joined today by Dr. Georgi Popov, Chair of Occupational Risk and Safety Sciences at the department at the University of Central Missouri, and Larry Sloan, who's the CEO of AIHA, the American Industrial Hygiene Association. Our topic today is why and how to make the business case for making enhancements to a work process or procedure to better protect worker health and safety. And a little deviation from our regular format, right, Gabe?
Yeah, just a little bit. It's not that bad of a deviation in the sense that it's definitely we talk about Safeonomics being the intersection of safety and business and how that all plays out. This is very much a deep dive into that concept. I mean, there's a lot of business terms, business concepts that are in this. I'm getting flashbacks to my finance days in listening to this recording. But yeah, some amazing case studies that are being brought up in this conversation, and a really good chance to kind of look at what does this mean to evaluate to actually build that business case for safety at a very granular level. So sit tight, hang on for the conversation. It gets a little bit it'll get a little bit mathy at points, but really great concepts.
Yeah, no, I was interested in this episode today, and definitely interested to see what anyone listening thinks, because a lot of times you're having sort of superficial conversations, and Georgi definitely dives right into the detail, presents the formulas, the calculations, and the rationale behind the business case for some of the improvements within those case studies. So it is like you say, a little deviation from a regular format, but really interested to see what people think. And I think it's an opportunity for us to explore some live sessions where maybe people can bring their current situations to us, and we can help definitely craft that business case. Because one of the things that Georgi says is taking the accountants to lunch was one of the most valuable things that he did, best money he spent. And last time I checked, I think we both qualify as accountants. So definitely take us to lunch, and
Yeah, exactly.
we can help you with your formulas.
Exactly. Well, that was one of the neat things about kind of digesting a lot of this conversation is, as you said, that there's questions that come up in it, and I'm sure that there are others that have others in our community that have questions about building that business case, understanding what do you mean about an NRR, or I'm sorry, IRR. NRR is for earplugs, but IRR, and then what is the net present value of this investment, things like that, and really looking at safety not as a necessary evil, but it's actually an investment. And just like any other investment, it has to have a return on it. So how do you actually calculate that? This would be a fantastic conversation to have with people live. I'm sure we could make that happen down the line, question mark.
Yeah, absolutely.
That'd be a ton of fun. But yeah, I think it is a very fascinating conversation. Looking forward to more of those in the future.
Yeah, absolutely. And if you're listening to it on the podcast, Larry and Georgi share a lot of graphics. They show the calculations that were used in the case studies. So definitely encourage you to pop over to the Safeopedia YouTube channel and check out the video format of it if you want to see the graphics. And also, I know Georgi and Larry were very open, to anyone who wanted to reach out. They were more than happy to share the presentation with them as well. So maybe with that, we can turn it over to Dr. Georgi Popov and Larry Sloan. Welcome, Georgi and Larry.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. So let's start off with the fundamental question, Larry. What do we mean when we talk about making the business case for EH&S projects?
Very good question, Scott. So let me first state that some of the comments that I'm about to mention come from an AIHA technical framework document that we published back in 2020. And it was titled The Keys to Effective Presentation of Your Business Case. We define these technical frameworks as what we say is the core knowledge and the skills that are required by an individual for the effective performance in a specific practice or area of expertise. And these frameworks are widely used as a resource for individuals that are looking to expand or refresh their knowledge or their skills, or if you want to develop a new training program within an organization. But to answer your question, we need to make the business case for interventions that either aim to reduce or eliminate adverse exposures to a particular hazard. It could be an airborne chemical, excessive noise, repetitive motion, radiation, etc. And these interventions occur by the application of something called the hierarchy of controls, which are used to modify the operation in some way. So we want to start at the top of the hierarchy of controls, right? And we say we practice avoidance early in the design phase of a new project, eliminating the exposure to the hazard. And then we work our way down the hierarchy to substitution. And then below that is engineering controls, administrative controls, and then finally, personal protective equipment.
Right. And so obviously, Larry, you're with AIHA, and a lot of our audience are the safety professionals. So for what type of professionals is this information critical to understand?
Yeah, and I would say that it's really critical for everybody who's listening, including the traditional safety professionals and engineers. Certainly environmental health and safety staff, EH&S generalists, whether they're skilled in IH or not, I think that they can rely on this type of information to help define what skills they need to make the business case, both to the workforce and to senior management. Also, I think this is applicable to line and senior management when they're working with human resources in making decisions on what kind of skills do their personnel need as they're rising up through the chain. And then finally, I would think that regulators would also be interested in understanding and seeing what is the effectiveness of the interventions and what are some practical examples that they can understand where the hierarchy of controls has been put into place.
Yeah, great. That's interesting. And you mentioned the business case that AIHA put together. I think you can download that off of Safeopedia or your website if people are interested in digging into that a little deeper. So thanks, Larry. Georgi, how does one go about making the business case?
Well, all business cases develop from a proposed intervention, and with the interventions, we're targeting occupational, environmental, health and safety hazards, exposures, or risk to enterprise that basically somebody believes we need to manage that. So the creation of well-written problem statement is a key to identifying the target interventions, or sometimes we call them solutions. So as a result, a scope of the project must be defined. So that is the first and critical step.
Georgi, this is a really critical process. So who all should be involved in it?
Well, good question, Larry. Many different groups, I would say many different groups of people should be involved. So internally, this may include line management, workers, or operators. In some organizations, they call them partners. In engineering staff, senior management as well. However, we should also consider HR or talent acquisitions that we call them these days, financial department, procurement, sometimes Lean, Six Sigma experts, and many others, if we consider that to be necessary. But let's see, did we forget an important group of experts? Who do you think is going to lead that team? Well, that should be us, occupational, environmental, health, and safety professionals. So, in a way, we might include other groups like public relations, regulators, and local community. And these could be considered external sources or external groups of experts that we may want to invite.
Yeah. Great. So Larry, what type of business objectives would be established before beginning this type of work?
Very good question, Scott. So first off, we want to demonstrate an understanding of the organizational key performance indicators, or KPIs, or there may be some other metrics across the various stakeholder groups. And some of these might be contained in the annual reports that are issued to stockholders each year. So we want to locate those sources of information in order to gain knowledge of the various business segments. We want to look at internal proprietary marketing literature and any other sources that show the top decision makers the value structure. We can then utilize the skills necessary to analyze this business case and its impact and metrics against the business objectives to make the case for the intervention, as well as offer improvements to the entire enterprise. Georgi, what else am I missing?
Well, probably we should consider several others. So we need to evaluate how EH&S opportunities will affect each of the business objectives, how they contribute to the business objectives. We want to effectively communicate the business objectives in order to get confirmation that they are correct. Usually you will find them on the website, or just like you mentioned, the annual reports. We will also want to establish an appropriate set of options for the interventions. We want to recognize that maybe a single alternative or something that will prevent us from going forward or stop doing something. Or it could be several alternatives. Usually we emphasize on layers of protection, and we'll discuss that later, but we may want to consider several engineering designs for controls or process modifications. And finally, we want to identify the regulatory constraints to the organization. In addition, we should probably mention the enterprise risk management model here. So we have to look at the so-called hazard risk or occupational risks, the operational risk, that's another quadrant. Then we have the financial risks and strategic risks. So these are basically considered the 4 quadrants of enterprise risk management. In fact, AHA is working on an updated enterprise risk management body of knowledge publication. So very often we hear that we're not invited to participate in executive level business decisions. Perhaps we can address some of these issues later if we have time. But there are actually amazing resources available to occupational, environmental, health, and safety professional members. We hope we can provide even more free resources to professional members in the future.
Yeah, that's great information, Georgi. And I think the message here is that, the occupational, environmental, health, and safety profession really needs to play a key role in meeting with these various stakeholders that we've talked about. And it's not just the occupational or hazard risks. It's, as Georgi indicated, these other types of risks that we'll get into a little bit more detail. There's also various process impacts that we need to consider. For example, who are the external stakeholders that should be identified? Specifically for those issues that are not financial or technical. Are there implications that are emotional or ethical that affect certain populations in the community around the facility, for example? We want to make sure we understand all of the inputs. So staffing, different methods, and different types of equipment to account for all the impacts that are being made or brought on by the change. And then finally, we want to map the impacts from a management of change framework, which is really, really important. We want to identify the lead time as we procure any new raw materials or equipment, the time it's going to take to install and test the equipment, training workers involved in using the new equipment, for example. All of that figures into the communication under management of change.
Right. And so, Georgi, like we hear from a lot of safety professionals, they want to make changes, implement improvements, and they struggle with explaining the financial impact. So maybe walk us through how safety professionals could work on defining these in order to move these projects forward.
Well, good question, Scott. I would say EHS professionals need a very good understanding of the financial theory tools. That will include discounting and present value, the criteria for selecting discount rates, inflation adjustments. We all talk about inflation these days in soft landing, no landing. You hear that quite often on the news. And we have to look at alternative ways of summarizing the overall financial benefits and the costs of investments, especially in prevention. And later on, if we have time, we can mention the difference between prevention and mitigation. But to start with the financial impacts question, we should look at the historical records and historical perspective. There's actually a lengthy history of industrial hygiene science contributing to the improvement of workplace environments and processes. Even so, it can be a challenge to evaluate and communicate the value of industrial hygiene programs and the different activities. So we have to communicate properly in terms that are understood and readily accepted by the organizational leadership. So this is often not being done, and sometimes we have different backgrounds, and we are looking at different leaders in different management styles. But we should absolutely include the traditional business matrix and methods in any of our analysis. So in recognition of the need to better understand and the tools to communicate the business value of industrial hygiene related processes and improvements, the American Industrial Hygiene Association and the Board of Global EHS Credentialing commissioned the value of the profession study. And that was a significant multi-phase project to develop and test strategy to analyze qualitative and quantitative value of work of the industrial hygiene profession. So the desired outcome of the strategy was to deliver a model for industrial hygiene and occupational, environmental, and health and safety professionals that could be used to provide compelling business case information. And that would help us understand the business value, and that will help us to be successful when we compete for limited resources, and we can demonstrate the value of occupational, environmental, health, and safety professionals and how we contribute to business and the operations team, and how we can communicate the facts that will help us understand what we bring to the table and how we can make our organizations to be more successful. So way back when, a team led by ORC Worldwide in collaboration with the National Institute of Occupational Safety and Health, NIOSH, undertook the task of formulating that strategy. But part of the challenge in describing the value of the industrial hygiene activities in terms that are understood and accepted within the business community was the term value itself and the meaning of it. So later on, we decided to modify that study, and we should probably, speaking of value and what kind of value we bring to the organizations, we should mention Warren Buffett, and he famously stated that price is what you pay, value is what you get, and that should be considered when we develop business cases. So as a result, the strategy actually framed the value of industrial hygiene practices and programs in terms of impact or the effect that they may have on the organization. So having determined this conceptually, developers of the strategy needed to select from options that are available, that we can measure and we can present as the value we create by impacting the organizational objectives. So one method that is widely used in the business community is the business case. So instead of calling it value of the profession, we decided to use common terminology like business case. So again, that's a defining concept, and we have to present that concept and accept the challenges with it. So based on the feedback from American Industrial Hygiene Association members, we were advised to simplify that model. And now these new simplified business case in environmental health and safety can be defined as structured method used to justify a project or intervention for decision makers. It actually captures the effects of implementing programs or activities on employee health and safety. That could be injuries or illnesses. We have to look at the risk management and the business process as a whole. So the effects will include many common financial business metrics like the net present value, internal rate of return, return on investment. Payback period is another one which is really important. But all these terms are really meaningful to the business management. So this tool, which is freely available, also includes non-financial benefits. And non-financial benefits are those that cannot be directly or easily monetized. So in reality, a business case answers the question, what's in it for the company? So and this new interactive AHA business case tool is aligned with international and national standards like ANSI, ASSP, ISO 31000, which the latest version of the standard was published in 2018, and that internationally recognized standard is titled Risk Management Principles and Guidelines. So I hope we have time, but let me share my experience and how I learned the importance of developing and communicating sound business cases for OHS interventions. So when I worked for an environmental company, we won a big project, and we were supposed to remove asbestos ceiling tiles, coatings and lead-based paint, and you name it. Well, sure enough, you start with risk identification, and based on my experience and what I learned early on in my career, if I remember correctly, I identified like 72 different environmental health and safety risks. And I went to my manager's office with a lengthy list of risks, and he advised me to go and talk to the CEO because that is going to be a significant project, and it needed funding in order to address all these risks. And sure enough, I went to the CEO's office and presented all the lengthy list with the identified EH&S risks. And I told him, well, we have a problem. Well, guess what he told me? He said, we don't have a problem. You have a problem. Now you go back to your office and tell me how we're going to fix it. So I quickly learned that upper level management doesn't want to hear about problems. They want to hear about solutions. So back then, we had, the simple hierarchy of controls. Engineering was the highest level of control and this and that. And I started looking for alternatives, and then the whole risk assessment, luckily at that time, the first version of the ISO risk management standard was published. So basically, I took that framework and developed a plan how we're going to address all these EH&S risks. So I went back to the CEO's office. He looked at it and that's better, much better. But can you tell me how expensive these things are and what's in it? For me, why would I invest in EH&S interventions, and why would I invest in prevention when we have such a good insurance policy? Well, later on, I learned that we had really high deductible, and I can honestly tell you, I didn't know enough about business case development back then, and I decided to buy lunch for our accountants, and that was the best money probably I ever spent, because next time I needed a number, they can produce that number easily for me. And once I realized that we had high deductible, and I said, well, instead of paying $1 million deductible, maybe we can invest that money in environmental health and safety. And they liked it so much. After that, I was invited to every meeting when decisions had to be made about projects, whether we want to bid that project or not. Now, there is also an opportunity to discuss prevention through design. So back then, prevention through design was in the early development stages. In fact, it started as safety through design, and way before that, of course. But in a way, NIOSH decided to establish the National Initiative for Prevention through Design to ensure that occupational injuries, illnesses, and fatalities are designed out of the process. And if possible, we would like to prevent the injuries and illnesses before they happen. So that's an important component of making the business case. And if you look at it conceptually, it like any solid building will have foundations, of course, and the two pillars will be risk assessments and risk priorities, and the hierarchy of risk treatments, and then we'll have sustainable operation, better quality, better reputation. Perhaps I should have mentioned that out of the 72 EH&S risks that I identified, the CEO told me that we're not going to be able financially to address all of them at once. So he wanted me to prioritize which ones were the most important ones to address this year, and then we'll budget for the rest of it for next year. So I hope this visual here will bring a little bit more understanding of the prevention through design concepts.
Georgi, I'm very familiar with prevention through design. I started out my career as a chemical engineer, and unfortunately, in my studies, there really was no focus on worker health and safety. We've talked about this in the past. NIOSH hosts the annual award now that AIHA is going to be a co-sponsor along with the National Safety Council and ASSP starting in 2024. So we're very excited about that. And Georgi, you received the NIOSH award back in 2022. So congratulations once again to you. It's a great honor. I've done a lot of reading on prevention through design, and I see it being referred to as transdisciplinary or multidisciplinary. What does that mean in simpler terms?
Well, Larry, that's a great question. In our profession, we very often use mitigation and prevention terms interchangeably, but these are not the same terms. So if you picture both sides of a bow tie, on one side we'll have the occupational, environmental, and health and safety risks, the preventive controls. In the middle, we'll have the so-called top event. And on the other side, we'll have the mitigation controls and the consequences. I know it sounds simplistic, and it's difficult to picture that in a podcast. However, let's start with historical perspective. A great expression for prevention versus mitigation comes to us from Benjamin Franklin. He famously advised that fire threatened Philadelphians in 1736. So he famously said that an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. So if we dissect the bow-tie methodology, we will quickly realize that we have to spend our valuable time and resources on the prevention side, hence the prevention through design initiatives. So recent surveys indicate that occupational, environmental, health, and safety professionals spend only 10% of their time on the prevention initiatives in the design phase. So industry surveys also indicate that we spend more than 70% of our time in the operational phase. I mean, compliance and retrofits. So imagine if we spent more than half of our time in the design phase and we concentrate on risk avoidance and elimination of health and safety and environmental risks. We very often hear that we're not invited to participate in the design phase. Perhaps we have to learn to use business language. We have to learn to use engineering terms as well. If we have improvement projects, usually that involves Lean and Six Sigma experts. So we need to learn to speak their language as well. But speaking, the most important part for me is probably the business language. And I mean, we have to communicate properly with upper level management. If we learn how to develop prevention through design business cases, we'll become more valuable members of the enterprise risk management team, which I mentioned earlier, the four quadrants: the occupational risk, the operational risk, financial, and strategic risks.
Yeah, that's great. And I want to just before we go any further, just want to mention, if people are listening to it on podcast, we do have a version of it on our YouTube channel where you'll be able to see the diagrams that Larry and Georgi are sharing. And I'm sure also that if anyone wants to reach out to Larry or Georgi, hope I'm not making any promises we can't deliver on, but I'm sure you'd be happy to share this information with anyone listening. So if you are listening while you're driving and you can't see the diagrams, like I say, you can check them out on YouTube or reach out to Larry and Georgi. I wanted to also circle back on something you said about taking the accountants to lunch and how valuable that was, because I think that's important as well, because you're not going to necessarily learn the business language overnight. So definitely taking that initiative to work with engineers and the finance department and helping to get more acquainted with the terminology that they use is important. And that's definitely one of the driving reasons why we did the Safeonomics podcast, was to help out with that. So but just going back to the hierarchy of controls, how does the prevention by design integrate into this?
Well, great question, Scott. I think we can modify the question a little bit. So very often I would describe prevention through design as a solid building with two pillars. And I really hope our listeners will be able to see some of the visuals that we can provide here. So I mentioned earlier, on one side, we have risk assessment and risk priorities, and then we would determine which ones are our risk priorities, because like I was told, and like we all know, we're not going to have enough funding to address all the risks at the same time, or even in 1 year time. So after we have determined the risks and risk priorities, then we can address the risks using the hierarchy of risk treatment, which I will provide a little bit more information about that. But I hope you can see that visual. We have solid foundations, design and redesign, where we're going to place the risk criteria, risk assessment, and risk treatment. And we have to manage that risk throughout the whole life cycle. And the two pillars, the risk assessment and the hierarchy of risk treatments, then we have a solid roof, which will ensure that we have a healthy and safe work environment and better quality, lower costs, and improved reputation. So because we're competing for valuable resources, we have to develop a business case and convince the executive team to invest in higher levels of controls. And higher levels of controls usually require significant upfront investment, but it will save money in the long run. In fact, the latest version of the prevention through design standard expanded the hierarchy of controls to include avoidance, elimination, substitution, minimization, simplification, passive controls, active engineering controls, warning and awareness devices, procedures and training, and finally PPE. So that is the so-called ALARP concept, as low as reasonably practicable. And we really hope that you would consider it next time you participate in the design phase. And I did mention earlier that higher levels of controls like avoidance, elimination, substitution, minimization, simplification will require significant amount of upfront investment, but it saves money in the long run. In a way, if you think about that, a British lord said famously many years ago that I'm not that rich to buy cheap things. So consider that concept next time you make decisions about the upper levels of controls.
Georgi, I like the ALARP figure that we're displaying, and you can see that, for example, minimizing, simplifying passive, active controls, they could be defined as subcategories under engineering controls in the traditional hierarchy of controls, triangle or pyramid. And so you're really adding gradations, if you will, of control strategies within the traditional elimination, substitution, and engineering rings or rungs of the ladder. So I understand that you also have another anecdotal example of how you have taken prevention through design and you put it into practice. Would you like to share that with the audience here?
Well, hey, that's a very good summary, and we should emphasize on the fact that you're engineer, so you have an amazing understanding of the hierarchy of controls and hierarchy of risk treatments. Perhaps I should mention the reason we decided to rename the hierarchy of controls to hierarchy of risk treatment is because if you avoid the risk early in the design phase, there is nothing to control, and risk treatment is more readily acceptable business terms and readily acceptable international risk management term. It's part of the ISO risk management process. But to go back to a really interesting case study, it will be a difficult task to summarize the case study without visual support, but let me try. So this case study should provide all of us, and especially occupational environmental health and safety practitioners, with a better understanding of how to use the 7 steps business case model. So this case study is taken from an exhaust tailpipe and muffler assembling facility located in the Midwest, and I cannot mention the name of the company for obvious reasons. But the company is a mid-sized manufacturer of exhaust tailpipe and muffler assemblies for pickup trucks. It's a 20,000 square feet facility. They receive the pre-cut tubing and the mufflers. They bend them, size them, and then they assemble them and weld them to completed muffler exhaust units. And that facility runs 2 8.5 hours work shifts per day. And that, of course, includes half an hour for lunch and breaks. So picture that 5 production welders work on each work shift, with 4 operating hand welders and 1 operating a Melton automated arc welding machine. So during the morning shift, 4 welders used the handheld trigger activated gun equipped with automatic filler wire feed, and the welding stations were not equipped with local exhaust ventilation. Now, that wasn't a problem up until around 2006. However, OSHA had reduced the permissible exposure limit for hexavalent chromium from 52 micrograms per cubic meter down to 5 micrograms per cubic meter. And of course, the corresponding action level of 2.5 micrograms per cubic meter. So exposure above these values will mandate a variety of follow-up and corrective actions. And because of the standards requirement located in 29 CFR 1910.1026 require that exposure assessment is performed to evaluate the welder's exposure. We had to take samples and evaluate the welder's exposure to hexavalent chromium. Here's another probably important point that we should mention. When we talk to upper level managers and engineers and decision makers in general, we should speak their language. And, if we start mentioning 29 CFR 1910, I can guarantee you they don't understand that, and it will be difficult to communicate that way. However, if we include a couple of visual examples and present the case to them that two of our welders were overexposed, which means that we have to address the risk of hexavalent chromium exposure, and they decided that we have to reduce absolutely the hexavalent chromium exposure to below the occupational exposure limits. In addition, we had to evaluate the design of the workstations to address musculoskeletal disorders. And some of you who might be able to see some of the visuals that we're providing will notice that these are significant ergonomic risks. So with that knowledge, the organization formed a risk reduction team, which comprised of industrial hygiene consultants, ergonomic consultants, engineers. The EH&S team was the lead, of course, quality and operations manager, and the welder. So the operators are the ones who are actually doing the work, and they're more familiar with it, and they should be invited to participate in the decision-making process. So according to the AHA technical framework that Larry mentioned earlier, which is titled The Keys to Effective Presentation of Your Business Case, the team would need to determine the purpose of the business case, identify the stakeholders, decision makers, and decisions or actions to which the businesses relate. And we also have to determine the scope and the limitation of the effort, a time frame, resources needed. And the project scope was somewhat limited to occupational health and safety and environmental risk reduction to welder operations, with special attention to hexavalent chromium exposure and musculoskeletal disorders risks. So we had to identify the key business objectives, and we can very often find the organization's business objectives on the website or annual reports that Larry mentioned earlier. But if we look at some of the examples, like business objectives could be business sustainability, but sustainability from a business perspective, excellence in environmental health and safety, retain talented employees, increase profits, and diversification of markets and customers. So these are very common business objectives for many organizations. But after that, we had to identify occupational health and safety risks. And we're all familiar with a number of different risk identification techniques. A good starting point is the identification of job task level risks, especially when the steps are easily segmented and divided. And this could be, we can start with the very well-known fundamental job hazard analysis, which is provided on the OSHA website. And it's still an amazing document. So for this case study, we visited the company, collected air samples and visual evidence, and we documented the work conditions. So for those of you who can see the digital images that we took from the facility, you will notice that in addition to the welding fumes going straight to the face of the operator, we also have to address the ergonomics risks to prevent musculoskeletal disorders. So based on the findings, the job hazard analysis form was completed, and we used it for risk identification. A great source of information regarding potential workplace exposures to chemical, physical, and biological agents that might occur in different workplace settings is located on the AHA website, and it's titled Industrial Hygiene, Hazard Identification, and Exposure Risk Assessment by Market Segment. So information from this website can help those developing job hazard analysis to have a starting point in how to identify occupational health hazards. And we can also learn about generic exposure profiles by market segment. So as a next step, we have to analyze and evaluate the occupational, environmental, and health and safety risks. So the tool that we developed, the AHA business case tool, will give you an option to use two different risk assessment matrices, 5x4 and 5x5. These are probably the most commonly used ones. In addition to that, you will notice that we have return on investment, financial summary, and non-financial benefits as well. But going back to our workplace case study with the welders, hexavalent chromium and lower back musculoskeletal disorders were considered high risk. In shoulder and neck musculoskeletal disorders were considered moderate risk due to lower likelihood of occurrence. And based on the risk analysis results, we selected the risks that were considered not acceptable. And like we mentioned earlier, you can't address 100% of the identified risks in short period of time. So prioritize them, and again, consider what's acceptable and what is not acceptable. So the assessment showed the risk to be high with remedial action required. Therefore, risk treatment options had to be considered. So it was obvious that control measures will have to be implemented, and the welders experimented with new welding helmets with supplied air system. However, such control measures were very unpopular with the welders. It slows down the production, and supplied air system was inconvenient for the welders. It required extra maintenance, training, and productivity was negatively affected. Therefore, higher levels of controls, or referring back to the hierarchy of risk treatments, had to be considered. So in order to reduce the hexavalent chromium exposure and eliminate the use of respirators, each manual weld station had to be equipped with local exhaust ventilation system. And the local exhaust ventilation system chosen captured the air close to the source of the fume generation and transported the air to an overhead conventional branched duct system where it was filtered and then exhausted. Now, that is really important because we have to capture hexavalent chromium fumes. We can't just exhaust that to the environment. There was a childcare facility nearby. Imagine that. To address the musculoskeletal disorders, adjustable welding workstations were designed. And as a result, the prevention through design solutions were agreed upon to reduce the risk for the welding operators. So to decrease hexavalent chromium related exposure risk, it was agreed that we'll develop and install that unique local exhaust ventilation system, and all the manual welding workstations were modified with height adjustments for ergonomics. And the result of prevention through design intervention was that the exposures were reduced even below the action level. They were reduced below 2.5 micrograms per cubic meter for hexavalent chromium, that is. Now, you can imagine that will require financial investment, and the risk reduction team performed financial analysis, and it was determined that the local exhaust ventilation system and adjustable workstations will be financially feasible based on net present value, return on investment, and internal rate of return, and especially the payback period. So if you look at it, it was calculated that net present value will be positive result, simple return on investment will result in 269% return on investment. Internal rate of return was also great, 82%. And payback period was only 1.2 years. So that is really critical and important. And that is how this financial analysis will look like. Not always, but that is just one example. But these are the most important financial terms that are used. So, like I said, I learned that the hard way. But when you talk to your upper level managers, you have to use their terminology. And that's what I was told, translate that to me in English, but my English. In their English was, sure enough, net present value, payback period, all these important terms. So the proposed engineering control reduced the exposure of hexavalent chromium. However, the productivity was negatively affected due to local exhaust ventilation system extraction of the important welding compounds and the temperature differences. So you will see here that that pollution prevention device that up a couple of, it was like 10 feet in high, when we need to replace that filter in the pollution prevention device, they had to stop production. They had to use ladders to climb there and replace the filters. It was challenging. And therefore, they had to consider even higher levels of hierarchy of risk treatments, and especially when we apply the slowest reasonably practicable flow concept that we mentioned earlier in the podcast. So not surprisingly, the risk reduction team decided to explore opportunities to automate the process and build complete enclosures for the workstations. And the management team issued requests for proposals, and sure enough, they selected the fully automated robotic welding station. So these design changes would still achieve significant risk reduction due to elimination of welders' hexavalent chromium exposure and elimination of musculoskeletal disorders risks. However, the enclosure prototype was built with sound fire blankets. That's what they call them. And these type of insulation bats was designed to provide sound control and fire protection. So we're addressing two EH&S risks with one control measures. And the pollution prevention system was designed to easily be accessible, and the filters will be replaced at ground level instead of shutting down production and climbing up there. So to understand how the proposed solution will impact the business objectives, we have to evaluate real or even anticipated changes that result from implementation of EH&S solution in the health status, risk management process, and business process. So we had to consider both financial and non-financial benefits. And sure enough, we mentioned earlier, net present value again was positive, payback period was a lot longer. But again, we're making these decisions for a long-term investment. So in a way, it was obvious that total initial investment was close to $1 million, $798,000 to be exact. And it was greater than estimated simple annual benefit of almost $500,000. So more complete financial analysis was performed, and it resulted in a similar return on investment of around 140%. And they considered that a wise investment, not to mention that we can operate the automated system for more than 8.5 hours, and it doesn't need brakes. And we completely eliminated the exposure to hexavalent chromium. So we also have to consider the non-monetary terms and some of the non-financial benefits in general. So any benefit that we cannot monetize should be considered a non-financial benefit. So picture the reputation of an organization. How do you monetize that? Well, it's difficult, but imagine what kind of impact on the organization, enterprise risk management structure, the elimination of respiratory protection equipment will have. Some of the welders were complaining that they had to shave every day so they can do proper fit testing. So these days we also have to consider ethical, religious, and social media issues. So I understand that it's not an ideal situation, and automation of the welding process eliminates completely the need of respiratory protection. So the last step is to communicate the outcomes, and of course we have to do that. We call that the 5-minute elevator speech. So you'll be lucky if you have 5 minutes. But when you communicate that, state the problem, state the solutions, not like I did. I initially said we have a problem. So state the problem, solutions, how we're going to reduce occupational health and safety risk, and how expensive that will be, and what kind of financial and non-financial benefits that will bring to the organizations. So I think we're running out of time to conclude. Occupational, environmental, health and safety professionals often relied on regulations and technical exposure assessments, and that is not the future, if you ask me. If we start communicating with 29 CFR 1910, that's not a good starting point, and regulations are amazing foundation, but from a risk perspective, we have to consider risks to the organizations from enterprise risk management perspective. Business leaders do not often have background in industrial hygiene or occupational safety, and they may not always see what kind of value we bring to the organizations. So again, to address the challenges, we have to learn how to use business terminology in risk reduction terms and how we manage risk in long term. So we would share resources, all of these visuals you can see in the AHA business case tool. But again, remember, higher levels of controls, prevention is always better than mitigation. And if we use the proposed methodology in the business case tool, it's a basically win-win scenario, and we can start developing business cases.
You know, Georgi, I just want to kind of close with a discussion that you and I have had about educating engineering students about prevention through design and the role of occupational and environmental health and safety. You know, we've done a great job of explaining the importance of OEHS or IH professionals understanding the business language. But I think on the engineering side, if there's a way for us as a profession to provide some very fundamental education to engineering curricula that helps to inform students, whether they're studying chemical engineering or mechanical engineering or electrical engineering, et cetera, the importance of prevention through design and the impact on worker health and well-being, and how they integrate that into their thinking is going to be critical as we look ahead. And so I'm hopeful that the work that you've done at the University of Central Missouri and the resources that AIJ has developed, in part with your leadership, can help inform a new course that could be marketed to engineering programs around the country at the undergraduate or at least the graduate level.
That's a great idea, Larry. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, well, thank you, Larry and Georgi. That was fascinating, great real life practical examples of building that business case. As somebody with a business background, I felt at home with the ROI and the internal rate of return and the payback periods. That's great to hear. And I think, I don't think I have any say in it, but anybody listening today should get advanced credits towards their business degree. If you're in safety or in industrial hygiene, I think this should count towards your business degree as well. So, and lots of resources, we'll get those listed in the description as well, so people can reach out and connect with Larry and Georgi and access the resources that we mentioned in the presentation today. So thank you again so much for your time. Super, super informative. I think it got to the practical details that safety professionals need in order to actually implement these concepts at work. So thank you again so much for your time today.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it.